Christian churches need to fight more. If your church is like most churches, then it probably does not have enough pugnacity in it. You may think there is already too much fighting in the church, especially among different denominations. But you know, the truth is, we have too little. What we have is usually directed against the wrong target. The first few words of Ephesians chapter 6, verse 12 sum up the sad state of the church. For we wrestle not. That's the problem. Oh, but there's more to this passage, and it sheds a lot of light on what is going on in the invisible realms around us. Let's take a look together to verses 11 through 13. Put on the full armor of God so that you can take your stand against the devil's schemes. For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of this dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. Therefore, put on the full armor of God, so that when the day of evil comes, you may be able to stand your ground. Paul goes on to list the spiritual armor that a Christian should be wearing, such as the breastplate of truth, the helmet of salvation, the shield of faith, the sword of the Spirit, and so forth. After listing each part of the defensive armor of the Christian, Paul stops talking in metaphors and gets down to reality. Notice verse 18. Pray in the Spirit on all occasions with all kinds of prayers and requests. With this in mind, be alert and always keep on praying for all the saints. Friend, there's a weapon right there. Prayer. My writer-producer, Tim Crosby, was once preaching on this passage to a Filipino congregation in Glendale, California. They had chosen this text as their focus for a day of prayer and fasting in preparation for an upcoming evangelistic campaign. This was the second time they had done this. A few years earlier, they told Tim, they had literally each gone for 24 hours without food to implore God to give them a new church. Now, at the time, they had no idea where their new church was coming from. Just 1 month later, they met to worship in their new building, one that had suddenly and mysteriously come on the market. It pays to wrestle with God. Now, according to Ephesians 6, our wrestling partners are not flesh and blood. In other words, our enemy is not any human being. Let's do a little experiment. Think of your worst enemy right now. Think of someone who just makes your life miserable or has done you wrong. Maybe you'd like to get your hands on that person and shake them up a bit, or worse. But wait, that person is not your real enemy. He or she is only a decoy. Your real enemy is a dark force, a being who is far more evil, far more intelligent, and far more powerful. And he's merely using this person, this human being, as a stooge to get at you. Both you and the person you dislike are really only victims of the supernatural power of darkness, the invisible forces of evil. So if you're going to fight, don't fight with the poor soul whom Satan is using to get at you. Don't aim your weapons at the decoy, and don't employ obsolete weapons. Keep in mind that in order to fight supernatural beings, We have to use supernatural weapons. That's why the Bible tells us to pray for our enemies. Pray for those who don't treat us right. Why? Because every prayer strikes a blow to the heart of the evil one. So next time you think someone's out there to get you, remember that things are not as they seem. Your enemy is not human. Not ever. Listen carefully. If we would only wrestle in prayer for one another, we wouldn't need to wrestle with one another. Do you get it? In Colossians chapter 4, verse 12, the Apostle Paul mentions Epaphras, one of his co-workers. In Colossians 4:12, the apostle tells the Colossians that he, that's Epaphras, is always wrestling in prayer for you, that you may stand firm in all the will of God. You see, we've got to learn to look beyond flesh and blood beings to the forces influencing them. Jan was a bright, cocky, young male student attending a Christian college who was determined to break all the rules, and he pretty well succeeded. One of the rules forbade drinking. Jan broke that one too. One day, one of his more spiritual friends decided to try to persuade Jan to stop drinking. The two students got into a long and elaborate argument about the pros and cons of the matter, and well, Jan won the argument. Jan was a very sharp fellow. Finally, it got late, so they parted, and each went to their respective rooms in the dormitory, with Jan as cocky as ever, and his friend was greatly concerned about him. That night, Jan couldn't sleep. He tossed and he turned and tossed, and in his mind he went over all the arguments for and against drinking. Finally, about 3 o'clock in the morning, Jan decided that his friend was right. He would stop drinking. The next morning he went to tell his friend the good news. He knocked, and his friend came to the door, looking rather bedraggled. "Guess what?" Jan began. "You were right. Drinking is stupid. I've decided to quit." "Say, how come you're still wearing the same clothes you were wearing last night?" "Well, Jan," said his friend, "I've been up all night praying for you." Now you see, this young man could have argued all night until he was blue in the face and still not persuaded Jan to give up that destructive habit. So he wisely decided to stop wrestling with flesh and blood and start wrestling with God. Today, or last I heard, Jan Haluska is a professor of English literature at Southern Adventist University near Chattanooga, Tennessee, all because someone cared enough to pray for him. We are wrestling with this very real dilemma of breaking down spiritual strongholds. And we get into arguments with friends about political parties and elections, presidents, and governmental policies. We are blissfully unaware of the spiritual forces behind the scenes that we are really up against. Satan keeps us lulled to sleep so we won't use our weapons against him. He knows how powerful those weapons are, even if we don't. Meanwhile, the forces of evil are on the march. Violence, Paris, London, Hong Kong, Korea, China, lootings, burnings, genocide, COVID-19. I mean, you don't even want to watch the news headlines anymore. It's just too violent, too wicked. In my private devotions, I've been wading through the lists of begats and kings and genealogies of 1st and 2nd Kings and 1st and 2nd Chronicles. Suddenly out of all this dialogue of incredibly shameful and horrible battles and holocausts in Scripture, suddenly comes this incredible promise of the Lord's covenant promise in 2nd Chronicles 7, verse 14. If my people, which are called by my name, shall humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, then I will hear from heaven and will forgive their sin and will heal their land. Talk about breaking down spiritual strongholds. Peter Wagner, in his book Prayer Shield, tells the story of a fascinating encounter on an airplane with one of the enemy forces. John Vaughan is a Baptist pastor, a university professor, and the editor of the Journal of the North American Society for Church Growth. Well, he was flying from Detroit to Boston to do a pastor's seminar. On the plane, he noticed his seatmate bow his head and move his lips as if praying. When he finished, John said, "Are you a Christian?" Well, the man seemed shocked by the question and said, "Oh, no, you have me all wrong. I'm not a Christian. Actually, I'm a Satanist." When John asked him what he was praying for as a Satanist, the other man said, "Do you really want to know?" John said, "Yes." The Satanist man said, "My primary attention is directed toward the fall of Christian pastors and their families living in New England." And then he asked John what he was going to do in Boston. After John told him about his ministry for the kingdom of God, the Satanist excused himself and indicated that he needed to return to his work. His work of praying to Satan to defeat pastors, especially in Boston and New England. That's sobering. Bill McRae, Chancellor of Ontario Theological Seminary, was pastoring in London when he discovered that a group of Satanists there had committed themselves to pray to Satan for elimination of a number of evangelical leaders in the city. In fact, that year, 5 Christian leaders fell through immorality and marital breakdowns. Did you ever realize that Satanists are praying for you to fail? You see, never forget this. We are at war. And in time of war, it is important to know who the enemy is. And it is vital to know our weapons. Often we think of prayer as a defensive weapon, something to protect us from evil. And it's true that prayer does work this way. In Psalm 50, verse 15, God says, "Lonnie, call upon me in the day of trouble. I will deliver you, and you will honor me." But you see, prayer is not merely a defensive weapon. It's an offensive weapon. We have the most powerful weapon ever given to humanity to be used in ransacking the kingdom of darkness, messing up Satan and Satanists and their plans, overturning their prayers. Our weapons, says Paul, are not the weapons of the world. On the contrary, he says, our spiritual weapons have divine power to tear down spiritual strongholds. Take a look at 2 Corinthians 10, verse 4. No multi-megaton bomb could touch the fortresses we're up against. We've got something far stronger. so strong that Christ told us that the gates of hell will not prevail against it. Matthew 16, verse 18. Now, most people take this to mean that the gates of hell are attacking the church, but are unable to prevail. But gates do not attack. What that verse means is that the gates of hell will not be able to withstand the onslaught of God's church. It is the church that is the attacker, or is supposed to be. So with a promise like that, why aren't we fighting to rescue those caught in the kingdom of darkness and bring them into the light? Or have we grown accustomed to the dark? Remember Daniel's prayer for understanding? One person, Daniel, one prayer. Daniel's prayer resulted in 3 weeks of warfare between the angel of light and the principality of darkness controlling the nation of Persia. Take a look at that in Daniel 10, verse 13. You know what? Because of Daniel's prayer, ultimately Gabriel prevailed. Perhaps in part because of Daniel's 3 weeks of fasting and prayer, which apparently involved abstinence from meat, rich foods, and so forth. Daniel's wrestling with God in fasting and prayer helped to determine the destiny of his nation and temporarily defeat the forces that opposed the rebuilding of Jerusalem. Say, what about your prayers for your nation, your president, your government? Listen, the kingdom of darkness cannot withstand persistent prayer for very long. Here's a modern gates of hell story. In 1992, Tim Crosby held 2 evangelistic campaigns in Mindanao in the Philippines. That's the red zone, not safe for Americans or anyone really. But Tim went. The Filipino laypersons, under the leadership of local pastors, visited in homes and gave Bible studies before the series even started. God blessed in the baptism of 476 persons in one day near the end of the series of meetings in that first campaign. Well, the second series was in Valencia near Mountain View College. That followed 2 weeks of preliminary meetings for revival under the leadership of Pastor Edwin Gulfin. Each night, a health lecture by Dr. Indrasanay Wijekanek, Dr. Indra, preceded the sermon. At the end of that 3rd week, well, a baptism had been scheduled on Saturday morning. I take the rest of the story directly from the diary that Tim kept on the trip, and he's passed away, so I can't have him tell that to you. Tim said, also working with our team is Dr. Indrasanay Wijekanek, that's Indra, from the South Philippine Union Mission, a converted Hindu and a gracious man, a man of faith. At the river where the baptism was to be held, Dr. Indra came early and found 2 huge bulldozers scraping gravel from the bottom of the river and making a horrible racket. He asked them if they would stop for a few hours while we had the baptism. They refused, saying they had a contract and had to get the work done. So Dr. Indra suggested that in that case, he would pray that God would cause their machines to break down. He did. He prayed. Shortly thereafter, the bulldozers stopped. And Tim said the mechanics were seen working on them with no bulldozer noises, nothing. By the time we arrived, peace prevailed. 24 ministers officiated at the baptism. The final baptismal total for that day was 408. More tomorrow on breaking down spiritual strongholds and storming the gates of hell. Stay tuned.